The night in Red Hollow always carried a cold drawn straight from early frost, a damp breath that sank into the grain of the houses along the main road. The smoke from old stove fires mixed with the tired piano drifting out of Remington's saloon, forming the muted rhythm of a small town on the edge of the frontier. Under the yellowed lamplight, figures moved with a slow drag, as though the day had drained every ounce of strength from them. Red Hollow was like that, never loud, but always holding something unpredictable, like a night wind ready to shift without warning. The saloon doors swung open when Cassian Holt stepped inside. He pushed his hat lower to hide the cold still clinging to his hair. His long dark coat carried a thin layer of dust from the road. His heavy boots struck the floor with a deep, steady sound. He looked like a man used to standing alone in fields that reached the horizon, quiet, anchored, and as still as Montana at the turn of the season. Cassian was not looking for anyone. He did not need anyone to notice him. He only wanted a decent whiskey after 3 months of land negotiations, sleeping on ground colder than stone, listening to the wind beating against his tent like a reminder that the path he chose had never been fair. Behind the counter, Zaya Ward lifted a tray with one hand, moving between tables as if she had done this work in another lifetime. The lamplight caught the warm brown of her skin, a soft glow that made her eyes deeper, sadder, like late autumn water. She spoke little, watched much, and always held her back straight, as though she refused to let anyone see the fears she kept inside her chest. Zaya did not look at Cassian when he walked in. Not the first time, not now, but she felt the shift in the room. Some men carried a weight that made the air adjust around them. She carried the tray toward the back door where the barrels were kept, and in the narrow hallway, under the dim wick of a lamp, she heard the voices of 2 unfamiliar men. Just a little. He drinks it, and we're done. I'm not sure. A man that size. No killing. Just humiliation. Cassian Holt stumbling in front of everyone. The whole region will laugh him off. He loses his standing, and he loses the land. Cassian's name halted her. Her chest tightened. She leaned toward a crack in the wooden wall and saw them dripping something from a small vial into the single bottle of whiskey usually brought out for important customers. Zaya stepped back, barely breathing. A shiver ran through her spine. She did not know the man. She had no reason to interfere. But the image of someone being shamed before a crowd, a cruel joke, hit a place in her she thought had gone numb. Simple decency. Cassian Holt did not deserve that. No one did. Zaya walked out of the hallway before her mind could stop her. In that instant, every sound seemed muted, the piano sagging, the card game pausing, laughter breaking off mid-air. Cassian had just laid a hand on his whiskey when Zaya rushed forward, barely feeling the floor under her feet. Her arm swept across. Crash! The glass flew from Cassian's hand, turning once in the air like a coin thrown in desperation, then shattered on the wooden floor. Whiskey streaked across the boards, its sharp scent rising at once. Shards scattered underfoot. The room fell into a strangled silence. The piano stopped. The card players froze. The smoke in the air seemed to hang still. Cassian turned, his dark eyes locking onto Zaya's wide, terrified ones. He was not angry, only startled. Zaya's hands shook so hard the tray nearly slipped. A long, heavy beat passed before Cassian spoke, his voice low and steady as stone. Why did you do that? That question, a thin thread between 2 fates, would pull their lives toward each other from that moment on. A second of silence passed, heavy as lead. Zaya stood there, breath breaking, her chest rising and falling as if she had run through the night. Cassian still had his eyes on her, yet something in his look forced her to swallow her fear. Then, Zaya's gaze flicked toward the corner of the room, the place where the two men had stood. A small glance. Quick. But Cassian Holt was the kind of man who saw every shift in a body as if it were survival instinct. He tilted his head, following her eyes. The two men, one short, the other thick-necked as a cut log, pressed themselves into the shadows, their faces dark under the lamplight, as though the dark itself wished to keep their secrets. The moment they saw both Cassian and Zaya looking their way, they startled. One yanked his collar up, the other darted a glance around, and the two slid back through the rear door like rats exposed to the light. Cassian lowered his gaze and looked at Zaya again, his eyes sharp enough to chill her spine. "Now talk," he said, soft, but his voice seemed to strike the bottom of the quiet room. "What is it?" Zaya gripped her apron, then did something she had never done in her life. She stepped closer to Cassian, close enough that his breath brushed her cheek. The warmth of him made her knees weaken for a heartbeat, but she did not stop. She stood beside him, leaned in, her lips near his ear, as though only that closeness was safe enough to speak the truth. Her voice trembled, almost too faint to hear. There were two men in the storage room," Zaya whispered. "They put something into your whiskey bottle, something that makes people lose control. They wanted you humiliated, in front of everyone." Zaya lowered her head, gripping her apron so tightly her fingers blanched. "I don't know who they are, but I heard your name. They said you have too much power, too much land. They want you to fall where everyone can see." Cassian did not answer at once. He stood still, weighing every detail she had given him. Then his eyes shifted to her hands, trembling so violently it looked like a light breeze could break them. No one could fake shaking like that. No one sweat cold just to tell a lie. Cassian knew truth when he saw it. That was why he was still alive. He tilted his head, his voice dropping lower. "You're shaking like you're the one they threatened." "I'm not." Zaya shook her head, trying to steady her breath, but her voice snagged. I couldn't watch. That's all." Something tightened in Cassian's chest. In a room full of people who might laugh to see a man brought low, it was the small serving girl who chose to stand on his side, though she didn't know him, though it could cost her the job she depended on. Cassian exhaled quietly. The sound faded into the silence. "You can't stay here," he said, not harsh, but with a certainty that leveled the ground beneath her. "You're in danger now, Zaya Ward." Zaya's head snapped up. "No, I can't leave my job. I owe rent. She stepped sideways to avoid his gaze, turning toward the counter, as if the night could return to normal if she simply went back to work. But Cassian reached out, catching her wrist. Not hard, not forcing, just enough to stop her. Zaya froze. Heat flooded the place where he touched her. A heartbeat slammed through her chest. She did not know this feeling. Fear tangled with something unsteady, like a door pushed open by a gust she was not prepared to face. You should let go," she whispered, yet she did not pull her hand back. Cassian looked at his large hand around her slender wrist. He released her at once, slowly, as if wary of hurting her, but his eyes never left hers. "You think I'll let you walk back as if nothing happened?" Cassian said, his voice low but firm. "You just stepped into the business of men who've been tracking me for weeks. If they know you listened, what do you think happens to a girl working alone till midnight?" Zaya pressed her lips together. She knew the answer. She had seen worse happen to people weaker than she was. "You must leave Red Hollow," Cassian said. "At least for tonight." "But I have nowhere to—" "You do." He cut her off, not loud, yet with enough weight to shake the doubt inside her. "Holt Ranch. I'm taking you there. Now." Zaya opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came. She saw something in his eyes. Not pity, not authority, but something that stole her breath for a moment. Proof that misplaced trust could still save a life. The two stood facing each other, an unbroken quiet no one in the saloon dared disturb. Cassian inclined his head, his voice lower still, steady as riverstone. "Come with me, Zaya. This place is no longer safe for you." And in that moment, whiskey still sharp on the floor, lamplight trembling as though holding its breath, her life veered onto a road no one could have foreseen. The night wind in Red Hollow cut through the birch stands like a tired whisper from the frontier. The moon laid a long silver band across the dirt road leading out of town, lighting the drifting layers of mist. When Cassian Holt brought out the horse, Zaya stood beside him, her hand gripping the worn apron strap until it twisted like the thread of endurance she had carried for years. "You can ride?" Cassian asked, his voice low, just enough to rise above the wind. Zaya shook her head. "I only sat behind someone else. Never held the reins myself." Cassian nodded, showing neither surprise nor judgment. Before she could think, he lifted her up, his hand at her waist. Nothing intentional, yet the brief contact sent a current through her that she was not ready for. When she settled on the saddle, Cassian mounted in front of her, pulling his coat around them to shield against the cold. The horse stamped once, and only when Cassian gathered the reins did Zaya notice where her hands had landed, around his waist. She pulled back slightly on instinct, but the movement only made her more aware of the warmth through his coat. "Hold on," Cassian said, his voice low and warm like banked embers. "The road's rough at night." Zaya hesitated, then placed her hand back where they were. Her fingers brushed his stomach, a closeness she had never expected to find herself in tonight. Cassian did not turn, but Zaya knew he had noticed. The horse began to move. Red Hollow grew small behind them. They said nothing at first, only the steady rhythm of hooves, the wind in the leaves, and Zaya's heartbeat pounding as if it wanted to escape her chest. "You did something brave," Cassian said quietly, as though the words had slipped past the stone around him. "I only did what I thought was right." "Most people don't choose right," Cassian replied. "Not when right comes with danger." Zaya looked down at her shadow stretching long under the moon. "If I stayed quiet, you'd have lost your standing. Some might think that is worth the price." Cassian did not answer, but his silence was not cold. It felt like the moment before sunrise, still, but full of meaning. A little later he spoke again. "What else did they say? About me?" Zaya drew a slow breath, steadying her voice. "That you own too much land here. That some men want to drag your name down to gain an advantage. I didn't understand everything, but they fear you." Cassian tilted his head. "Fear me?" "Not you," she said. "What you represent." Cassian did not smile, but she sensed the quiet surprise in him. A serving girl from the lowest rung of the town had managed to separate the man from the shadow he cast, something even wealthier men failed to do. "You see through people fast," Cassian said. "Not everyone wants to see me, so I learned to watch." The words made Cassian pause. Though he did not turn, she sensed the shift in tone. Him. A very old, very quiet ache, like a mirror held up to his own loneliness. "They don't see you," he said, "but I do." The night wind seemed to stop for a beat. The horse shifted, and Zaya loosened her grip in alarm. Cassian's hand came back at once, covering hers, steady, surprisingly gentle. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "I won't let you fall." The words were simple, ordinary, but in the dark, with Zaya's vulnerability laid bare, they became the first promise between two people learning to trust. Zaya said nothing. She only tightened her hold, not from fear now, but from something else. A warmth rising from his touch, running to her throat, leaving her unable to speak. They rode through the dim stretches of land. The sky opened above them like a doorway into night. Zaya rested her forehead lightly against Cassian's back, so slight it felt like she was hiding it from herself. And Cassian, he did not turn. He said nothing. But she felt his shoulders ease, as though he too had found a quiet he had not touched in years. That night, before Holt Ranch appeared in sight, something small but true took root between them. The first thread of trust, one that would carry them through storms yet to come. Morning light slid through the wooden frame like a thin sheet of silk, falling across Zaya's face and coaxing her eyes open. The small room she had slept in still carried the scent of pine and the familiar soap of someone who had made up the bedding for her. Outside, roosters crowed and hooves struck the ground in a distant rhythm. Zaya lay still for a moment, letting a feeling wash over her that she had not known in years. Safety. No clatter of dishes, no drunken shouting, no wind slicing through the cracks of a flimsy boarding room door. Only a quiet so gentle she gripped the edge of the blanket, as if to make sure she had not dreamed it. She sat up, her feet touching the cool wooden floor. When she walked to the window, Holt Ranch unfolded before her. Open fields washed in pale sunlight, the horse barn steaming in the early chill. And there, beside the barn door, stood Cassian. He was fastening the bridle of a young horse, sleeves rolled, mud streaking the hem of his white shirt. In the morning light, Cassian looked both rugged and untamed, as if he belonged to this land long before it carried a name. Zaya stood still, her hand on the window frame, her eyes fixed on him. Then Cassian looked up. Their eyes met across the wide yard. Zaya startled, dropping the curtain too late to keep him from holding her gaze for a breath longer than expected, not out of surprise but out of something softer, warmer. She went down to the kitchen where Mrs. Harvin was already at the stove, turning eggs in a cast-iron pan. The older woman narrowed her eyes when she saw Zaya. "Up already, are you? Must have been a long night." Zaya gave a small smile. "A little, yes." Mrs. Harvin watched that smile longer than needed, then let out a small, knowing huff, as though she had lived long enough to spot things before they took shape. Zaya reached for a cup on the table just as Cassian stepped in, carrying the scent of morning wind, horses, and earth. He reached for the cup beside hers. Two hands, one large, one small, touched the same handle. Both froze. Zaya pulled back first, but her fingers brushed the ridge of his knuckle, so slight no one could have seen it, yet both felt it clearly. Cassian said nothing, but a faint flicker crossed his eyes, not awkward, not deliberate, something hollowed out and warm, like a man reminded that touch could shift a heartbeat. Zaya looked away, though the spot on her hand still tingled. The Holt Ranch kitchen was smaller than she expected. When she bent to take a sack of flour from the lower cupboard, Cassian stepped in at the same moment. They nearly touched. His shoulder grazed hers. His warm breath brushed her ear before he eased back. "Sorry," Cassian murmured. "No, it's all right," Zaya said, though her heartbeat raced as if she had run halfway across the fields. He leaned aside to let her pass, but the closeness was enough for her to notice the dried mud on his shirt cuff and the faint soap on his skin, a scent unfamiliar but so gentle she had to steady her breath. When they finally sat at the table, Cassian let his gaze rest on her face for a moment, long enough for her to feel it, not long enough to name it. He looked as though he was thinking something he was not used to admitting even to himself. Zaya lowered her eyes to her bowl, trying to avoid the weight of his attention, but the corner of her mouth lifted, a reaction she could not contain. Mrs. Harvin set a plate of bread on the table, then planted her hands on her hips, watching the two of them with the look of someone who had lived long enough to understand truths the young did not say aloud. "Lord," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Zaya to hear. "This kitchen is about to crack under all this quiet." Zaya flushed. Cassian cleared his throat, staring out the window as if the sky had suddenly become vital. But silence could not stop what had begun. Those small collisions, fingers, shoulders, glances, had opened something fragile and truer than anything either of them had touched before. Something beginning to grow between two souls long accustomed to being alone. Noon on Holt Ranch always carried a particular stillness. Not the stillness of loneliness, but the calm that belonged only to wide land and few people. Sunlight slanted through the kitchen window, falling across Zaya's hands as she wrestled with the bread dough like two strangers trying to find a shared language. She wanted to help. She wanted to repay. But flour, yeast, warm water, everything seemed to resist at once. Zaya mixed the dough too hard, then let the yeast sit too long. When she baked it, the oven groaned as if disappointed. A faint smell of burning drifted out. Zaya frowned. If only I cooked as well as the ranch wives. She pulled the tray out and regretted it instantly. The rolls, meant to be soft and golden, were dark around the edges, their tops cracked like dry earth, and a tap against them sounded like stones. She stared at her creation, her hands trembling with embarrassment. At that moment, Cassian walked in. He stopped, looked at the tray, then at Zaya, then at the tray again. The corner of his mouth twitched, a rare sign. Zaya rushed to speak first. I think something's wrong with the oven." Cassian raised a brow, stepped closer, and picked up a roll. He pressed his thumb into it. No give. He tapped it. Tock, 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 like a raven pecking rock. Zaya covered her face, wishing she could sink into the floorboards. And then, something no one on Holt Ranch had seen, Cassian Holt laughed. Not a polite, closed-mouth smile. Not the faint nod he offered strangers, but a real laugh. Deep, ringing, shaking the kitchen like spring water rushing after the thaw. Zaya lifted her head, her heart skittering. She had never seen him laugh like that, an expression that made him look a decade younger, warmer than the fire burning in the stove. "Zaya," Cassian managed between breaths, "I think you've just created a weapon. Please stop laughing." Zaya buried her face in her hands, mortified. But Cassian set the roll back down and stepped closer. "I'm not laughing at you," he said, his voice softening. "I'm laughing because it's been a long time since anything felt this good." His hand brushed her elbow, light as wind. Zaya looked up and met his eyes. eyes warm, honest, carrying something she did not dare name. She swallowed the feeling rising fast inside her. Why did one smile from him hold such power? They cleaned the messy kitchen together. Zaya wiped flour from the counter. Cassian gathered the broken pieces of bread. Each time their hands brushed, Zaya pulled back like a spark had leapt between them. "Did you follow the recipe?" Cassian asked, teasing gently. "I followed what I remembered. Next time, let me teach you." He stood beside her, close enough that his words brushed her temple, warm to the point of unsettling. Zaya turned. His face was very close. Too close. Her heart kicked against her ribs. "You know how to cook?" she asked, trying to keep steady. "I lived alone for many years," he answered, placing his hand on the wooden ladle just beside hers, their hands meeting for a heartbeat. "You learn what you must." Zaya looked away first. She breathed slow, needing space before she slipped into something she wasn't ready to face. While washing dishes, Cassian spoke unexpectedly. "I once thought I'd marry a city girl." Zaya froze. Water ran over her hands, but his words cut through with the sharpness of a thin blade. "You and she asked softly. "No." Cassian dried a plate, eyes drifting toward the window. "She liked what was pretty, clean, predictable, but a ranch isn't any of that. She wanted me to change to fit her world, but that was never right for me." Zaya gripped the towel tighter. Part of her felt an odd relief. Another part, more dangerous, trembled. "I'm stepping into dangerous ground," she thought, and she knew it. She felt the emotions growing each time he looked at her, each time they brushed past one another. Cassian glanced at her, as if he wanted to say more, but finally he said only, "You don't need to be like anyone else. Just be yourself." Zaya lowered her head, hiding the softness that rose inside her. Because sometimes, the simplest words were the ones that shook a heart the hardest. And that noon, amid flower, firelight, and Cassian's first real laugh, the thing between them began to take shape, warm, fragile, and carrying a danger neither of them would be able to turn from. Night wind rose on the prairie early that evening, strong enough to make the wooden door tremble with each gust. Holt Ranch settled into the sounds of wide country, wind sweeping across the roof, grass brushing together on the hills as if whispering something distant. Zaya stood by the window, her hands still faintly shaking after the accident that afternoon. A young horse had bucked hard enough to nearly throw her onto the packed earth. If Cassian had not caught her, she touched the shoulder still aching, remembering the moment he held her. The first time he held her that long. Not from instinct, but from fear for her. The door opened softly. Cassian stepped in, coat dusted with dirt, hair ruffled by the wind. "You all right?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Zaya turned, trying to hide the tremor still clinging to her. "I'm fine now. Just a little shaken." Cassian moved one step closer, only one, but it closed the space between them until she could hear his breath in the draft coming through the window. "Don't be afraid," he said, his eyes firm yet gentle. "I'm here." A strong gust swept through, wrapping the curtain around Zaya's hand. She startled, and before she could speak, Cassian set his hand on her shoulder, slow, steady, warm. It stayed longer than it needed to, as if he, too, needed the contact. "This afternoon," Zaya whispered, "I thought I might fall." "You nearly did." Cassian leaned slightly, his voice close enough to warm the side of her neck. But I wasn't going to let you. Zaya pressed her lips together, her heartbeat too loud in her chest. Why do you worry about me like that? I'm only someone you brought home from a troubled night. Cassian held her gaze, unwavering. Not only anything, Zaya. Her breath caught at the way he said her name, soft, like embers settling. She drew in a breath, fighting the sting at her eyes. I don't belong here. I'm not someone who has a place. In town, everyone sees me as someone standing outside the door. You're not outside any door here, Cassian answered at once. Not while I'm in this house. Zaya shook her head. You don't understand. I'm used to being overlooked, to no one truly seeing me. Cassian was silent for a moment, a silence that made her look up. I do understand, he said. You're not the only one who's felt left behind. The truth of it tightened something deep in her. Cassian, the calm, steady man impossible to read, carried the same loneliness she did? I once loved someone, Cassian said quietly, but she wanted me to change to fit her world. I couldn't. And in the end, I learned something. Some people are meant to stand in the crowd, and some are meant to stand beside someone when everything else goes quiet. He looked at her for a long time, a look that touched the deepest part of her. A stronger gust pushed the curtain between them. Cassian lifted a hand to move it aside, and when his fingers brushed her cheek, she leaned instinctively toward the warmth. The moment was too close, too real. Zaya, Cassian's voice roughened. She could not tell who leaned forward first, only that his breath reached her lips, warm, slow, hesitant, a wordless question. She closed her eyes. The kiss touched her softly, nearly afraid to startle her, then deepened, not rushed, not forceful, but as if two people long in the dark had found something they did not dare hope for. When they parted, Cassian rested his forehead against hers. Zaya, he whispered, the words a confession. She could not finish, but he understood. He touched her cheek, his fingers trembling slightly, with feelings held back too long. Cassian took her hand and guided her toward the bed, but without urgency. Each step slow, as if asking whether she agreed. She nodded, barely, yet it was the clearest answer she had ever given. Moonlight spilled across the wooden floor, lighting their faces as they drew closer. Cassian's hand cupped her face as if holding something too precious. Zaya pressed her palm to his chest, feeling the steady, honest beat that made her swallow hard. There was no haste, no struggle, only two solitary souls giving each other a place to belong. Moonlight trembled across their shoulders. Wind outside the door rose in a long, quiet song. And that night, through gentleness, through trust, through breaths shared in the dark, they opened the first door of love, a door from which there was no turning back. The morning after that wind-tossed night arrived quietly, as if nothing had happened. The sun climbed over the distant hills, casting a faded gold across the roof of Holt Ranch, and the last trace of night wind lingered under the eaves, like a faint reminder of something that had just begun. Zaya woke first. She felt the warmth before anything else, the warmth of the man lying only a small distance from her. Then she felt the truth. Then the fear. She had let things go too far. She had crossed a line. And now, how was she supposed to face him? Cassian was still asleep, his breathing even, his arm resting loosely near the edge of the bed, as if he had tried to keep space between them once she drifted off. That respect only tightened something inside her. A murky dread that she didn't deserve this, that he was acting out of duty or out of pity. She rose carefully. The blanket slipped from her shoulder, falling like a quiet reminder of the night before. Her throat tightened. Zaya stepped off the bed as softly as she could, drawing in a slow breath, holding on to calm the way one holds a fraying thread. She could not afford mistakes, could not afford to hope, could not allow herself to believe that something beautiful was meant for her. Before Cassian opened his eyes, she had slipped out, closing the door with trembling fingers. Mrs. Harvin was stirring porridge when Zaya entered the kitchen. The older woman gave her one look, a look long enough, knowing enough, that Zaya dropped her gaze to the wooden floor. "Tea?" the woman asked. "Yes, please." She set the cup before Zaya and said nothing more. But Zaya knew. The woman had seen everything. The uncertainty, the careful steps, the heart trying to hide beneath a steady face. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Zaya startled. Cassian. He came in with his hair slightly tousled, shirt hastily thrown on, and eyes that found her instantly, like reflex. Zaya jumped up, avoiding his gaze. I was going to check the hens, see if I can help." "Zaya." Cassian said her name softly, but it held her in place like an invisible rope. She turned slowly. His eyes met hers, not the eyes of a man regretting, nor of a man confused, but of a man who had already decided something, clearly, without hesitation. "Last night," Cassian said, "was not a mistake." Zaya flinched, a swell of relief and fear rising at once. I don't want you to feel obligated," she said. "It's not obligation." Cassian stepped closer. "It's choice." The simple words made her sink into the nearest chair, her knees unsteady. Cassian did not touch her. He held the space between them as if waiting for her to cross it, if she wanted. Throughout the day, between ranch chores and moments inside the house, their closeness didn't vanish. It only changed shape. When Zaya handed him a cloth, their hands brushed just a heartbeat longer than needed. When Cassian stood behind her to show how to cut rope, his breath skimmed her ear, and she flushed so deeply she had to bow her head. When they carried water to the field, his gaze held hers long enough to say, "I remember the night." Zaya felt the shift clearly. Not loud, not hurried. More like a hidden stream running beneath stone. Quiet, steady, powerful. And what frightened her was exactly that. Not the night before, but everything after. Toward evening, Cassian fastened his gun belt before heading out to check the north fence. Zaya paused when she saw him securing the holster. "They're still trying to hurt you," she said softly. "Yeah." Cassian drew his coat over the grip. "But it's not just me anymore." Zaya looked up. "What are you worried about?" "That I don't fear danger for myself," he said, his gaze meeting hers with steady weight. "But I do fear it coming near you." Zaya's heart tightened, then opened, painfully and warm. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a vow. But it was a promise all the same, one given without saying the words. Something between them had tied itself into place, strong enough for both to feel it, fragile enough to make them careful, real enough to make every breath heavier. Cassian stepped toward the door, but before leaving, he turned. "Zaya," he said softly, "don't pull away from me." She stood still, her hand pressed to her chest. I'll try." Cassian smiled, a small smile that lit the whole room. That's enough. The door closed behind him. Zaya watched his figure disappear into the dusk, knowing that what she felt had outgrown a single night. It had become something she could not take back. And because of that, her heart trembled and strengthened at the same time. The harvest festival arrived earlier than usual that year. All of Red Hollow Valley wore the honey gold of new straw and ripe apples. Paper flags fluttered along the road. Children chased each other around pie stands and cider carts. The air felt like a warm, bright quilt. Yet for Zaya, this was still the town that had once looked at her in ways that made her want to shrink her spine. She had never imagined coming back. But at dawn, Cassian stood on the Holt Ranch porch, sunlight falling across his shoulder, and held out his hand with only 3 words. "Come with me." She placed her hand in his before she knew what she was doing. The wagon rolled into town to the sound of lively violins. But before the wheels even stopped, Zaya felt the eyes. Some recognized her. The black girl who once worked at the Silver Lantern Saloon. Some didn't know her name but knew Cassian Holt, and that alone made them stare with a curiosity she did not want. Zaya lowered her head, breath catching. Maybe I shouldn't be here." Cassian didn't answer right away. He simply reached down and found her hand, not forcing, but not letting her pull away either. "You don't stand alone in this world anymore," he said quietly. "Not while I'm right here." Whispers began to spread. "It's her. Worked at the saloon. Holt brought her here." Zaya heard every word. Each one brushed an old wound. She tried to pull her hand back, but Cassian held tighter and turned to face the murmuring crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Standing straight, calm-eyed, he brought the street to silence as if waiting for his judgment. "She's with me," Cassian said, his tone steady but carrying a weight that smothered every whisper. "And I won't hear another word." Zaya froze. Her throat warmed as though someone had laid a hand over it. Never, in any place she'd ever been, had anyone stood for her like that. Openly, directly, without flinching. They stepped into the square where the harvest musicians played. The scent of baked apples drifted through the air. Cassian turned to her again, extending his hand, not commanding, simply offering, "Zaya Ward, will you dance with me?" She laughed softly, like early autumn wind. "I don't know how." "Good," Cassian said. "I'm no better." They joined the circle of dancers. Cassian's hand settled at her back, warm and sure enough to loosen her shoulders. She placed her hand on his. The closeness felt right, as if the place had been meant for her long before she knew it. Cassian's first step fell out of rhythm. Zaya's next step followed suit. Then they collided, hard enough that she caught his arm to steady herself. Cassian laughed first. A rare, deep laugh warm enough that those around them smiled without knowing why. "You're ruining the dance," Zaya said, trying to sound stern. "No," Cassian replied, his eyes brighter in the sunlight. "Just trying to find the right rhythm with you." She looked away, but her heart couldn't keep pace. The music slowed, gentle as dusk. Cassian drew her closer, his hand at her waist, as if letting go would tilt the world. His breath touched her temple, warm enough to melt every thin layer of defense. Amid the noise, Zaya heard only the quiet words he spoke, just loud enough to keep the wind from carrying them off. "You don't have to hide anymore. I'm right here." Zaya lifted her gaze. Cassian looked down, steady, warm, leaving no room for doubt. A look any woman would know, not for someone sheltered, not for someone in his care, but for someone chosen. In front of the whole town, he said softly. I want them to know you're the one I stand beside. Zaya bit her lip, her chest tightening with something strong and fragile enough to bring tears in the middle of the square. Cassian leaned his forehead to hers, a confession without flowers or rings. The music ended, but Cassian didn't let go, and Zaya knew their steps would not separate easily after this. At that year's harvest festival, among the crowd and the flags and the bright morning light, Cassian Holt chose her, and Zaya Ward, for the first time in her life, was no longer standing at the edge. She stood at the center, where a heart was opening for her. The evening after the festival, Red Hollow returned to its familiar quiet. On the ride home, Zaya sat beside Cassian in the wagon as the last scraps of fabric flags fluttered in the night wind. From a distance, Holt Ranch glowed with oil lamps set along the porch, like a house waiting for someone to come back to it. When they arrived, Cassian didn't walk her to her room. He said, "Come with me for a moment." His voice low and steady, yet something in his eyes made Zaya's heart tilt like a door shifted by wind. They crossed the yard, where the grass had begun to gather dew. Cassian carried an oil lamp, its warm circle of light spilling across the ground around them. He led her to the newly built shed on the east side, where the scent of pine still lingered from the carpenter's work. The new wooden door opened with a sound soft as a breath. Inside, the room was neat and open, the ceiling beams still pale, untouched by sun. A thin breeze slipped through the cracks, stirring the lace curtain Mrs. Harvin had pinned up earlier, making it sway like someone breathing quietly. "Why bring me here?" Zaya asked, her hand rising to her cheek to hide the tremor beneath her excitement. Cassian didn't answer right away. He set the lamp on a wooden ledge, letting its light fall across his sharp features, softening his eyes until they deepened and gentled. "I wanted you to be the first to see this place finished," he said, "because it means something to me." Zaya walked slowly through the space, her fingers brushing the fresh grain of the wood. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Not as beautiful as what I'm about to say." Cassian whispered it. Zaya turned, and in that moment, Cassian Holt knelt. Her heartbeat struck hard enough for her to hear it. The lamplight flickered in the breeze, casting a trembling band of gold across his shoulder. Cassian looked up at her, his eyes stripped of their usual calm. Only something raw and honest remained. "Zaya Ward," he said, his voice drawn from the deepest place in his chest. "I love you." Zaya covered her mouth, breath catching. "I love your courage. I love the way you look at me as if I'm not the man this town whispers about, but simply a man who needs to be believed in." Her breath shook. "I love every small thing about you, and I want you to be my wife." There was no ring, no flowers. Only a man kneeling in a new wooden shed, with a lace curtain trembling behind him, and a love as steady as the beams above. Zaya stepped back, as if her body meant to run while her heart meant to leap toward him. She lifted a hand to her eyes, tears falling too quickly to stop. "Cassian, what are you doing? You know who I am." "I know," he said. Cassian rose but didn't touch her, giving her room to breathe. "You think you're unworthy. I see that more clearly than anyone." Zaya broke into quiet sobs. "I'm just a saloon girl. I have a past, too much I'm ashamed of. I have nothing to give you, no name, nothing except myself, and you deserve better." Cassian stepped closer, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders, but only when she didn't pull away. "Zaya," he said, slow and certain. Love doesn't ask permission from your past. The words cut through everything she had built to protect herself. He lifted a hand and wiped away the first tear. I don't want you because you're perfect, Cassian continued. I want you because you're the one who brought me back to life. Zaya's breath hitched. Cassian. And if you say yes, he said, I want to build a life with you. Here, on this ranch, in this home, beside me, not behind me. The lace curtains swayed harder, like the wind sighing for them. The lamplight caught the tear on Zaya's lashes, making it shine like dew. She looked at Cassian, long and full. Then she placed both hands over his where they held her shoulders, lifting her face with a trembling yet dawn-bright smile. Yes. Cassian let out a breath he might have held for years. He bent and pressed a kiss to her forehead. So light, it felt like a vow. In the new wooden shed, beneath lace and warm lamplight, Cassian Holt's proposal became the most beautiful thing Zaya had ever touched in her life. The wedding day arrived like a morning gentler than any other at Holt Ranch. There were no grand bells, no lavish dress, no elaborate rituals the town liked to fuss over. Only an open sky, prairie stretching to the foothills, wind carrying the scent of dry grass and fresh wildflowers. Cassian wanted everything simple, just as the two of them had found each other. No display, no ornament, only truth. Zaya stood in the small room wearing the dress Mrs. Harvin had sewn over 2 weeks. Not silk, just soft white cotton trimmed with a few simple lines of lace. But when she put it on, she felt lifted by an unseen hand. A girl who had once lived in shadow, now wrapped in something pure. That thought tightened her throat. Mrs. Harvin stepped forward, her hands trembling as she adjusted a fold at Zaya's shoulder. Good heavens, child. You're beautiful, she whispered, her voice thick, as if holding back tears. Cassian's a lucky man. Zaya touched the woman's thin hand and nodded gently. I'm lucky, too. The 4 words made Mrs. Harvin turn away to wipe her eyes. Outside, Cassian waited beneath the birch tree, the same tree where, last winter, they had sheltered from the rain, and he had draped his coat over her shoulders. He wore a white shirt, a light brown vest, his hair combed yet still carrying the roughness of a ranchman. When he saw Zaya step onto the porch, his stride halted. That look, the look of a man seeing his whole future walking toward him, made Zaya's heart give a single, stunned beat. The ceremony was small, with only a few ranch hands, an old minister who had known Cassian since childhood, and Mrs. Harvin standing in front, her hand pressed to her mouth in silent emotion. Yet its smallness made everything warmer. Wind swept through the grass, blowing white petals from the neighbor's little girl's basket. The scent of fresh-cut lumber from the newly repaired shed drifted in the air. The minister spoke the blessing in a voice old but steady. Cassian held Zaya's hand, not tight, but enclosing hers completely, as if to say, from now on, you don't shoulder anything alone. When asked if he agreed, Cassian answered without a pause. Zaya met his gaze, nodded, and smiled with a tremor as delicate as a new winged butterfly. When Cassian leaned down to kiss her, a soft, careful kiss, like a first kiss meant for someone he feared wounding, everyone fell silent. No clapping, no cheers. Only the quiet smiles of people watching something honest take root before them. After the ceremony, they gathered in the yard beneath a string of oil lamps Cassian had hung the night before. There was cornbread, stew, and a small wedding cake Mrs. Harvin had baked, crooked on one side but full of affection. Ranch hands offered blessings, some shaking Zaya's hand, some clapping Cassian's shoulder. None of the wary glances she'd once received remained, only the acceptance of someone now belonging to this place. At sunset, golden light fell across Zaya's hair as Cassian stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her back. Without words, she knew what he was feeling: gratitude, pride, a quiet happiness he could no longer hide. Their wedding night did not arrive with storm-like passion, but with the peace of two people who had searched long enough to finally find each other. They entered the simple room lit by one warm oil lamp. Cassian paused at the door, as if to make sure Zaya did not feel pushed into anything. "Tired?" he asked, voice low and gentle. Zaya shook her head, stepped close and placed her hand on his chest, where his heartbeat pressed steadily beneath the fabric. "No," she whispered. "Just happy." The words made Cassian kiss her, this time deeper, unhurried, not forceful, full of respect. He moved slowly, as if wanting to hold every moment. They lay beside each other in the lamplight. Not a night of urgency, not a night of breathless hunger, only warmth, two hands finding each other in the quiet, words spoken softly, without needing to be complete. Zaya fell asleep in Cassian's arms, the sound of his heartbeat becoming the gentlest vow of her life. And in that plain room, beneath the still prairie night, their new life began. Not loud, not grand, but beautiful in a way no name could capture. The first years after the wedding passed like spring water drifting through the foothills. Holt Ranch did not change through grand events, but through small shifts so subtle that Cassian sometimes had to stop in the yard, look around, and realize his life had altered without him noticing when. Mornings became softer when Zaya came down to the kitchen in a white apron, her hair braided simply at the nape. Cassian often leaned against the doorway, quietly watching her stir the pot, sometimes reaching out to straighten the cloth over her shoulder, a simple act that still managed to turn her ears red. Noon brought laughter, laughter the house had never held enough of. Zaya liked to hang linens on the porch rail, and Cassian liked to stand below the steps, watching her touch each wooden pin as though tending something fragile and precious. Sometimes she turned around, and their eyes met, and the intimacy spilled so easily that both of them ended up laughing. Their first season planting together was much like their marriage. Not perfect, not smooth, but full of effort from two hands working side by side. When Cassian taught Zaya to tie rope, she failed 3 times, each time making him laugh at her furrowed brow. But his hands always closed over hers, slow and careful, adjusting each knot as though what mattered was not the rope, but the closeness. Then one summer afternoon, when the light had turned honey gold, Zaya came to him with a small smile he had never seen before, and when she placed her hand over her belly, his eyes darkened with emotion at once. "Cassian," she said, "we're having a child." He went still, as though the wind around them had stopped. Then he held her face in both hands, and his lips trembled. Cassian Holt, the strongest man in the valley, shaking openly from joy. "You're sure?" he asked, as if afraid it was only a dream. Zaya nodded. "Yes, I'm sure." Cassian pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, as though he had too many words and not enough breath to speak them. From that day on, his worry nearly turned the whole ranch into amusement. He wouldn't let Zaya carry a water bucket, wouldn't let her climb a ladder, wouldn't let her lift a pot. "You're carrying my whole world," he said, with such earnest weight that Zaya was torn between tenderness and the urge to tease him forever. In the months that followed, Zaya's belly grew like a sweet secret only the two of them shared. Cassian often rested his ear against it at night, listening to the tiny movements like small waves against his hand. And each time he lifted his head, his gaze was soft as evening. The night Zaya went into labor was a windstormed night, just like the one when their love had begun. Cassian panicked enough to knock over a chair as he ran for Mrs. Harvin. But when he entered the room, he became strangely calm, the calm of a man pouring all his strength into safeguarding two lives at once. "I'm here," he said, gripping her hand, his breath unsteady but his eyes never leaving hers. Zaya cried out in pain, but in her most wavering moments she felt his hold steady, strong as a rope pulling her back from a ledge. And then, amid the wind outside and Mrs. Harvin's quiet instructions, the child let out its first cry. Thin, high, but beautiful enough that Zaya broke into sobs, and Cassian turned his head for a second, as if to hide the breaking open of his heart. "A boy," Mrs. Harvin said, with a trembling smile as she placed the baby in Zaya's arms. Cassian bent slowly, looking at the tiny life resting against his wife. The child's eyes blinked open, as if to take in the world, a world held by two people who loved each other until the room felt full. Zaya looked up at Cassian through tears and whispered, "We did it." Cassian touched her cheek, so gently it felt like a prayer. "No," he said. "You did. I'm just thanking heaven for bringing you into my life." The baby slept in lamplight, in his mother's arms, under the quiet smile of the father beside them. And Holt Ranch, once filled only with wind and hoofbeats, now held an extra breath, small, new, carrying the future of a family. 20 years is long enough for land to change, for a person to grow, for a home to fill with laughter. But it is also long enough for one small moment, once forgotten by most, to become a quiet legacy carried through every season of wind at Holt Ranch. This evening, Zaya sat on the wooden porch steps, where the last light of day stained each weathered grain a deep golden hue. Her hair, once dark as night, now held threads of silver that glimmered beneath the dusk like frost on morning grass. Her hand rested lightly on her teacup, her gaze drifting across the fields where her grandchildren chased one another, their laughter ringing all the way to the northern ridge. One girl with springy curls tumbled into the grass and sprang back up, just as her mother, Zaya's firstborn, had run wild across this ranch 20 years before. Zaya smiled, her eyes misted not with sadness, but fullness. Footsteps she knew by heart sounded behind her. Cassian stepped onto the porch, holding the old coat he still wore nearly every day. He had aged, broad shoulders now slightly bent, his stride slower. But his eyes were the same ones she had looked into at the Silver Lantern Saloon decades ago, warm, steady, and meant for her. "Too many little ones out there," Cassian said as he sat beside his wife. His voice was deeper, roughened by years, yet still the voice that had carried her through every fear. "The more the better," Zaya replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "This house used to have only the wind. Now it has children's laughter. It's like the land feels young again." Cassian chuckled. "Like you, I grow old, and you look the same every day." Zaya laughed, nudging him softly. "Old man, you're sweeter now than when you were young." "When I was young, I didn't know how to say these things." Cassian touched the back of her hand, his calloused rancher's hand, always knowing how to hold her as gently as a flower. "If not for you," he said, I would have grown old in this house alone. Evening wind swept through the fields, carrying the scent of dry grass and wild blossoms. The sky widened until age and time seemed small beneath it. Only the sense remained that every moment on earth held a bit of light one could touch if still enough. "Do you remember that night?" Zaya asked softly, still watching the children. "The night I knocked the whiskey out of your hand?" Cassian leaned back, letting out a low laugh, deep as stone shifting in a packhorse's saddlebag. "Of course I do. You rushed in like a storm gust, sent the glass flying, then stared at me with eyes like you were afraid of something bigger than the dark inside that saloon." "I was afraid," Zaya admitted. "Afraid of getting dragged into trouble. Afraid of being disliked. Afraid of being hurt. Afraid of you." Cassian turned to her, the warmth in his older eyes unchanged after all these years. "So was I," Hita said. "Afraid of opening up. Afraid of loving and losing. Afraid you'd see the darker corners inside me." "And then?" Zaya asked. "And then you did what you did," Cassian replied. "You reached out. You were brave for 1 second, and I never forgot it." Zaya laughed softly, her eyes shimmering. "I wasn't thinking that far." "You didn't need to," Cassian said, closing his hand around hers. "Sometimes a single second of courage is all it takes. 1 second, to change an entire life." The sun dipped behind the hills, staining the world gold. The children kept running, their laughter scattering like birds taking flight. And Zaya, the woman who once trembled in a saloon, now sat in the center of a vast ranch, surrounded by family, held by a love that had weathered 20 winters. Cassian squeezed her hand gently, reminding her that everything they had grown came from that moment, when a girl who thought she had nothing dared to reach into fate and alter the path of her whole life. Night wind rose, carrying off the last gleam of sunset. Zaya tilted her head, whispering, to Cassian, to herself, or to the past she had overcome. "A single second of courage can give you a lifetime of love." And Holt Ranch, beneath the soft evening sky, seemed to nod in agreement. If this story touched your heart, especially our older viewers, please share a comment. Tell us which brave moment in your life led you to the happiness you have now. And if you'd like to continue wandering through tender love stories like this one, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We treasure every visit you make here.